Hey, my name is Jono Darville, and I want to tell you a little bit about my life and ministry. So, I became a believer in early 2006. I had moved to New York City in late 2005 to work in the fashion industry. And I was at a casting for a modeling job one day, and a guy named Seth Whalen came over, introduced himself to me, and he said, "Hey, are you new to the city?" I was like, "Yeah." He said, "Well, why don't we grab lunch afterwards?" We did. And halfway through lunch, I realized that he was evangelizing me. And I grew up around the church. And so I knew a little bit about what he was getting at, but he invited me to this ministry for people in the arts. And I was just lonely enough at the time that the next week I went. And there was a ministry called Models for Christ. And there were a group of men and women who were all a few years older than me. There were all these makeup artists and fashion designers and models and photographers who also all happened to love Jesus. And what I often say, because I wasn't walking with the Lord at the time, is that after watching them for a number of months, that watching them live was like hearing life spoken in its original language for the first time. And there was something beautiful and really captivating about the way that they lived. They showed me what it looked like, not just for Jesus to be Lord of the church, but for Jesus to be Lord of the boardroom, in the bedroom, in the billiard hall, in the voting booth, for Jesus to be Lord of everything. And so after a number of months of sharing the gospel in their life with me over and over and over again, finally, one day after a long night out, I crawled out into my living room in Queens, New York, and cried out to God. And essentially I said, "God, if you're there and you're real and this story about Jesus is true, you can have me, but you're gonna have to change me." And the Spirit of God showed up in my living room and invaded and transformed the condition of my heart. And I got off my living room floor that morning just a different guy. And then it seemed as if God was calling me into marketplace ministry. And so I got involved in leadership in this ministry called Models for Christ. And I was working in that industry, and my career began to develop. And I worked for clients like Louis Vuitton and Bloomingdale's and Hugo Boss. And so I got to travel to places like Paris and Greece. And so there was a period of time that I lived in Greece. You go to these smaller markets to build up your book. I lived in Greece for about 3 months. And you live in these models hotels. And it's like living in Sodom and Gomorrah. But on the way over there, I felt the Lord prompting me to start a Bible study. And as it turns out, the guy that was managing the hotel happened to be a believer. He let me use the adjacent building, the roof. And so we cleaned off the floors, and there were these beautiful white painted floors on the top of this building. You could see the Acropolis off in the distance. And so I started this Bible study on Friday nights, and God just moved powerfully in my life and the lives that those were there. A number of people came to faith. It was being there and then coming back and sharing the story of what God had done in Greece that became evident that God was calling me into ministry. My apartment in New York got terribly flooded, and there was serious water damage and mold growth, and this triggered for me, unfortunately, some serious health issues that went unexplained for a very, very long time. And so unfortunately, that began a 14-year journey of me suffering with chronic illness and things going from bad to worse. So to fast forward, in 2017, I was on a business trip in Boston and noticed that I was losing the ability to walk. I had dropped down to 108 pounds and was dying of starvation. I have a rare pain disorder called chronic functional abdominal pain syndrome, but they didn't know it at the time. And so I ended up bedbound for 3 years, from 2017 to 2020, right before COVID hit. I was in a bed. Early 2020 comes around right before COVID, and I get rushed back to UNC Hospital. And basically they took me there to die. My family said goodbye, family flew in to say goodbye. I was telling my precious wife that I wanted her to remarry, and God intervened at the 11th hour. He used UNC Chapel Hill's Research Hospital not only to get us an accurate diagnosis, but to get us a treatment plan that saved my life. And so after 10 days, they sent me home, but it took 8 months for me to recover because they had to slowly nourish me back to health. And so now my wife and I use our story of suffering to point people to the hope that we have in the gospel. And so in the midst of that story back in 2014, my wife and I reconnected and wrote letters for 3 months and fell in love. And so I have this precious, precious bride who once told me it was her honor to be called to suffer with me, and was by my side through all of that. And so now that I'm healthy, God has restored my health. My wife and I are just been so blessed. We've got 2 precious kids, Jono Abraham, who is almost 4, and our little girl Hattie, who's almost 1. Once I got healthy and God blessed us with these children, I decided to go finish seminary, which I did. I have a Master of Arts in Christian philosophy and apologetics. And so my ministry areas, the areas that I specialize in, are apologetics and public theology. And I'm a regular contributor to the Center for Faith and Culture at Southeastern Seminary, where I'm a fellow. And I also write for outlets like the Gospel Coalition. So this website that you are checking out has resources like my articles or the sermons that I preach. But in addition to that, I've recently written a book. This book was birthed out of 20 plus years of conversations with everybody from high school students to college students to young adults who have asked me, Jono, I understand what it means for Jesus to be Lord in principle, but what does it actually look like for Jesus to be Lord of every area of my life in practice? The title of the book is Life in its Original Language, a guide to being truly human. And so our little taglines for this are that this book is the book that you wish you had read and that hopefully you'll want every new and young Christian to read, because it will practically introduce them to the Christian faith and practice and give them a guide for living the Christian life in a modern world. And so it's George Whitefield and Abraham Kuyper for 21st Century Streets. And so I hope that this ministry and our ministry really serves you well in helping you discover and deploy the gifts that God has given you for the advancement and the enjoyment of His kingdom in the world.